Bonjour. Ça marche ça, non? Vous m'entendez? Oui. Thank you for this invitation. I'm very glad to be here since it was my summer school. And I'm glad to present some reflections concerning the links between biodiversity and health and the way this issue are integrated in public policy today in France. To begin, a few words concerning France Stratégie, which is a quite old institution created in 1946 after World War II in order to rebuild the economy of the country, and which name was changed in 2013 in the General Commission on Strategy and Forecasting. France Stratégie has four main missions: to anticipate change, to propose public policy options to the Prime Minister, to evaluate current public policies, and also to debate with all the stakeholders. And we are around 40 experts at France Stratégie, and we rely on a diverse expertise based on sociologists, economists, engineers, and there is also one biologist. It's me. So, what's the place of biodiversity and health today in public policies? In fact, it's a very recent public policy, since the notion of biodiversity is a quite new notion. The word biodiversity appeared only in 1988 with a famous book of Wilson. And it's only in 1992 that this notion appeared at the international level with the Convention on Biological Diversity at the Rio de Janeiro Earth Summit. In France, this CBD was ratified only in 1994. The first national strategy for biodiversity was published in 2004. And it's only in 2016 that the word biodiversity appears in a law with the Law for the Recovery of Biodiversity, Nature and Landscapes. This law was an answer to the mass extinction of biodiversity, which is well known today, with a lot of converging scientific data concerning the decline of biodiversity, with, for instance, the decline of flying insects biomass, which was studied in Germany, the decline of birds in France, notably in agricultural areas, and the decline of vertebrates from 32% to 60%, according to the studies and according to the regions. The causes responsible for this decline are now well known, notably land use change due to urban spread and deforestation, which is one of the main causes of this erosion of biodiversity. Climate change has also a huge impact on the local development and repartition of wild spaces. The increase in meat consumption linked with intensive farming is also today causes which is well described, and notably due to the greenhouse gases emission linked with meat production. Intensive agricultural practices with a high level of water consumption, notably linked with irrigation, and the destruction of agroecological infrastructures like permanent meadows, hedges, ponds is a main cause. And finally, the use of pesticides that leads to decrease the population of insects and to decrease the population of their predators. Public policies in France, but also at an international level, distinguish two kinds of biodiversity. Remarkable biodiversity, which value relies on non-economic values. It's, for instance, scarcity or cultural value, and this biodiversity could be protected through the reintroduction of wild species or the development of protection areas. And there's also an ordinary biodiversity, for instance, the agricultural cultivated biodiversity, which value may be assessed through the notion of ecosystem services assessment. Ecosystems are defined by the interaction between the biological community and the physical environment, and the ecosystem services are defined as the benefits those ecosystems provide to people. There's a vast array of those services, from tangible goods as food to some more invisible goods, notably the removing of carbon dioxide, for instance. We can distinguish four main groups of ecosystem services. The first one is what we call supporting services that provide living spaces for plants or animals. The second one is provisioning services, that's to say the services that provide tangible and harvestable goods like food, wood, minerals, and health products. There are also regulating services linked with the regulation of environment, for instance, the prevention of erosion, the purification of water, or the storage of carbon. And the last one, which is quite important and less well known, it's cultural services, which are the many non-material benefits derived from nature, for instance, recreation, spiritual or cultural benefits. Here is an example of ecosystems, the marine ecosystem, and we can see that there are a lot of services provided by this ecosystem, from food production or to biochemicals or pharmaceuticals components, to coastal protection, carbon storage, and water quality enhancement. And there's also an important cultural and spiritual goods linked with notably the enhancement of recreation and tourism. Those ecosystem services could be assessed, and an important work was conducted from 2001 to 2005 by the United Nations Environmental Programme, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which gave a lot of information concerning the condition and trends in the world's ecosystems, and which also gave a scientific basis for action to conserve and use those ecosystem services as sustainably as possible. And in France, this assessment was declined in a national exercise, l'évaluation française des écosystèmes, which was conducted by the French Ministry of Sustainable Development. After the assessment of ecosystem services, there's another interesting step, which is the monetization of these services. And some studies have been conducted on such topics. For instance, we could evaluate the services given by barrier reefs in order to protect coasts from flooding. We can also evaluate the service of pollination, which represent about 150 billion euros per year. And some scientists consider that the global value of nature services is around $125,000 billion. So huge values of these ecosystem services. So what's the link between biodiversity and health, and more generally, the link between environment and health? The different parts and compartments of environment are linked together. For instance, there's a clear link between climate change and stratospheric ozone depletion, between land degradation and climate change, between land degradation and biodiversity. And all these issues have direct or indirect impacts on human health. Concerning the links between biodiversity and health, biodiversity has direct effects on health, notably through disease regulation and pollution control. But biodiversity has also indirect effects, notably linked with cultural goods and cultural values, which have impacts on human well-being. So, to sum up the links between biodiversity and health, we can distinguish 5 main groups of relations. The first one is that biodiversity supports food security and dietary health. We need genetic diversity in food systems in order to provide the foundation of crop development and to have healthy diets. Biodiversity also provides important resources for medical research and for medicine, since a lot of drugs are directly derived from wild species. Biodiversity plays a role in the regulation and control of infectious diseases, notably by increasing the risk of emergence or spread of infectious diseases in animals, plants, or humans. The conservation of biodiversity, and notably the protection of ecosystems linked with biodiversity, is essential for climate change adaptation, which has direct and indirect impacts on human health, notably through heat island effects, for instance. And on top of that, ecosystems could reduce disaster risks. And we know that people who have been displaced due to disasters or conflict are more susceptible to illness. So now 2 examples of links between biodiversity and health. The first one concerns chronic inflammatory diseases, notably respiratory inflammatory diseases. These diseases are directly caused by outdoor air pollution, and they are directly or indirectly influenced and mediated by the environmental microbiota. And we know today that the biodiversity, the green structural and functional biodiversity, has direct effect on outdoor air pollution, on environmental microbiota, and of course indirect effect on the reduction of those inflammatory diseases. Another example which is interesting is the example of ambrosia. It's not an infectious disease but an allergy. It's a very important allergy in France since it's the main cause of allergy in towns. And it costs around 41 million euros per year to society due to consultation, due to drug expenses, and due to work stoppages. This plant is an invasive plant which was introduced at the end of the 80s in France through the transportation of goods imported from Canada. And we discovered that ambrosia grows in France only in poor environments without competing plants, and its dispersal over the territory, in fact, had followed moved roadsides. So we understood only recently that by letting wild grasses grow on the roadsides, we will limit the development of this plant and we will limit the development of this allergy. So it's an example of the direct influence of biodiversity on health and also on the economy of health. So, from my point of view, from the point of view of France Stratégie, how could we combine health and biodiversity in the future of public policies? And one example which is quite interesting is the transition towards sustainable food systems, which is one of the solutions in order to combine these different issues. What is a food system? As it was defined in France in 1996, it's a set of activities that contribute to the food function in a given society. Today, in France, studies have shown that the food system has good points, notably it ensures the self-sufficiency of the country in food, but is also associated with negative externalities, notably environmental and societal externalities. So we have to combine those different and contradictory issues in order to rebuild the food system, and of course it needs to combine biodiversity and health subjects. The first issue is the environmental issue. France, the French food system, is associated with huge losses and waste from farm to fork, which represent around 5% of the greenhouse gases emission of the country. So this is an issue very important to consider in the way to rebuild the food system. Climate change is, of course, a very important issue, and in France, the agricultural sector represents around 20% of greenhouse gases emission, notably due to the use of nitrogen fertilizers and the production of methane by ruminants. So it's another issue to consider, notably linked with the nitrogen fertilizers use, which have direct impacts on water pollution and the degradation of air quality. And we observe in France, from the beginning of the 70s, an increase in the use of these nitrogen fertilizers. There's also an important increase in the use of pesticides in France, even if there are a lot of regulation which aims at reducing this use and at developing alternative way of produce agriculture. Another environmental issue is the degradation of soils. 18% of soils are degraded today in France, in metropolitan France, and this quantitative degradation is associated with qualitative one, with notably a loss of soil biodiversity and a decline in organic matter. So we have the combination of externalities, of environmental externalities, notably the rise in greenhouse gases emission, an increase in pesticides and fertilizers use, a degradation of soil in qualitative and quantitative terms, and those factors have direct effects on biodiversity and impacts it directly. So we have to take into account those issues in order to imagine a new food system. We have also to take into account the health issue. The health issue in terms of food security, since in France we have around today 4 million of people which have access each year to food aid, so it's a very important issue to consider. And we have also to project our reflection in the long term, since an increase in the population of the country is evaluated in 2050, we will be around 72 million inhabitants in France, and we will have to nourish the population of the country. There's also, of course, an issue of food safety. In France, we have the beginning of a kind of epidemic of obesity, with around 15% of adults concerned by obesity and concerned by the intercurrent diseases linked with obesity, and notably type 2 diabetes, which concerns 3.3 million cases in France today. There are, of course, also infectious foodborne diseases, and there are an increase in chemical risks, notably linked with the use of pesticides, which could have endocrine disruptors effects, and also the use of nanomaterials on the food chain. Recent studies have shown that there's a direct association between the decrease in risk of cancer and the presence of pesticide residues in food. Notably, this publication, which is very recent and which had a huge audience in France 2 weeks ago. The last point is the economic issue, since in France the food sector is, in terms of employment, very important. Food industry is the first industrial sector in France, which represents about 750,000 employees, but there's a constant decline of the employment of the agricultural sector in France since the 50s. This economic issue also concerns mean incomes of farmers. In France, we have a high variability of these incomes according to production and according to years of production. And the mean income in 30% of farms is inferior to 350 euros per month, which is very low according to the mean income of the French population. And this income is notably for some production, mainly compounded by public subsidies and notably by the subsidies of the common agricultural policy. So we have to take into account all these issues in order to rebuild food systems based on sustainable diets, which are defined by the Food and Agriculture Organization as diets with low environmental impacts, which contribute to food and nutrition security, which are also protective and respectful of biodiversity and ecosystems, which are culturally acceptable, accessible, economically fair and affordable, nutritionally adequate, safe and healthy, while optimizing natural and human resources. So, to reach this purpose, we have to lift numerous socio-technical locks, and we have to mobilize, to implicate all the actors of the food systems, notably through a better coordination between actors, through innovation at the production step and also during the transformation. And we have also to give new opportunities by differentiating products in order to let consumer choice products according to the impacts on environment. Today this transition is in course since there are an evolution in diets in France, notably with a more important consumption of organic food and this market is increasing today in France. And there are also new tendencies in consumption, in food consumption, with less meat consumption, notably linked with animal welfare subjects and the emergence of new consumer behaviors, notably veganism or flexitarianism. Consumers have also to be guided and to be informed on the impact of food on the environment, and there's notably the possibility to inform them on the environmental footprint of food products, which is notably included in the energy transition law, which was published in 2015. So it's a way to inform consumers and to guide consumers in order to have more sustainable diets. We have also to improve the food supply in collective catering, which is very important in France. It's around 40% of meals in France which are in collective catering, and a recent law proposed to increase the level of organic, local or quality food products in collective catering. We have to mobilize economic and tax tools in order to modify the food systems, and notably in order to remunerate environmental services, for instance the presence of permanent grasslands, which have an important role to play in order to reduce carbon emissions. We could use those public tools in order to reconnect livestock and crops, to support self-reliant and resilient farms, to support organic production, and we can also use tax tools in order to set up bonus penalties for pesticides and fertilizers. Of course, we have to guide farmers towards agroecology, and training, innovation, advice are very important to reach this purpose. We can also guide farmers by the use of long-term contracts in order to compensate the risk they take when they modify their way of working. And today, this transition towards more sustainable food system has become a political subject, a political issue, notably with the statement of the French Assembly of Regions in 2014, which promote local and short food chain productions, which promote family farming and alternative marketing circuits, and which promote low environmental impact on agriculture practices. So, to conclude, we saw that there are direct and indirect links between biodiversity and health, and by protecting biodiversity, health is enhanced, so it's very important for public policies. The assessment, the characterization of ecosystem services and its monetization is a tool to define the policies, the future policies for biodiversity conservation. And to be as effective as possible, environmental public policies have to combine some contradictory issues, notably to combine environmental, economical, societal issues in a systemic approach. The transition of food systems toward more sustainable food system is a key to reach this purpose, and notably to combine biodiversity, environmental issues and health issues. But there's no single solution for that, but a multiplicity of options we have to mobilize jointly in order to reach this purpose, notably by the modification of the common agriculture policy and by the development of agroecological practices. And this purpose have to respect a twofold requirement. Of course, the reduction of the environmental impacts of food systems, and also to provide farmers the right to remuneration for their work. Thank you for your attention.
Any question?
First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. I have just a little and simple question. In your first slides, I saw a word that I didn't understand. What do you mean by biomimicry?
Biomimicry. In France, it's biomimetism. It's the way you study biodiversity in order to create new products. And for instance, sharks. C'est difficile à dire ça. Vous êtes française? On peut le faire en français? Non? Il y a eu des études, par exemple, on a étudié les requins, la peau des requins. Je vais essayer de le traduire après. On a étudié la peau des requins et ça a permis d'inspirer notamment le développement d'ailes d'avion, par exemple. Alors, ça peut être utilisé, le biomimétisme, en recherche biomédicale. Et on peut essayer d'évaluer le comportement d'agents pathogènes, par exemple, et les relations entre agents pathogènes, sur la base de ce qu'on observe au niveau d'écosystèmes entre agents biologiques de taille plus importante.
Thank you very much. So, do you can provide us with more explanation about the eco-taxation and the ecological responsibility for companies in terms of accountability towards the environment, and given more and more priority to reach the targeted objective of reducing the environmental impacts and making a sustainable environment. And another point is about the biodiversity in terms of marine ecosystem and the maritime biodiversity. So do you can underline some aspects of this thematic? Thank you very much.
The first question concerns the use of taxes?
The eco-taxation and the ecological responsibility of companies.
Oh. Eco-taxation is a current issue in France today with the taxation of gasolines. It's a good example of the difficulties we have to tax behaviors and to use taxes in order to modify the behaviors of consumers. And for instance, the eco-taxation of meat is a question which was studied a lot, and you have perverse effects by taxing meat consumption, for instance, since extensive farming have positive impacts on biodiversity, but intensive farming have globally negative environmental impacts. So you have to you have to make the balance between environmental effects, which could be sometimes very contradictory. So it's difficult in a technical point of view, but it's also very difficult in a political point of view. And for instance, the case of taxation of carburant, of gasoline in France is a very good example of this difficulty. And your second question was, I don't remember. Ah. It's an important point. To be clear, this question is difficult because sometimes you have a kind of greenwashing behind some measures taken by societies in order to reduce their impacts on environment. But it's certainly one way to enhance the impacts of those societies on the environment. So there's no regulation in France in order to develop it, but it's in fact initiative which could be taken by enterprises and societies freely. Oh, it was this one? Yes, in fact, the marine ecosystem provides a lot of services, a lot of ecosystem services. So the destruction of marine ecosystem have, of course, implication on those services. You want I present it more deeply? Yes? Oh, okay. The first service provided by a marine ecosystem is food production, with notably the production of fish, shellfish, algae. But you have also other services like the enhancement of water quality, since the marine ecosystem could remove pollutants or toxins by captation, by physical captation. It also plays an important role in coastal protection by the reduction of waves, and it's the example of barrier reefs, which have mechanic effects on the reduction of the impacts of waves on the coast. The storage of carbon, notably due to algae, is very important in the marine ecosystem. It's another service which is described here. You have cultural and spiritual identities and goods notably linked with religious concepts. Marine ecosystem has also an important role in the economic sector of tourism. It provides biochemicals and pharmaceuticals products, which are very important, notably in medical research for pharmaceutical industries. And that's all. It's only a representation of all the services which could be given here for this example.
Okay, thank you very much. Shall we now welcome Mr. Play from the Food and Agriculture Organization? Thank you very much, Mr. Fosse.